Hi, I'm Connor McKnight, and you're listening to Road to the Rate. It is a player dev minor league focused podcast devoted to the guys that will be the next Chicago White Sox. I'm really excited about this show. I'm really excited to get this out there and get started. The Road to the Rate has been bubbling for a little while here. It's a new thing for me. In case you don't know me, I'm on TV doing CHSN on the field and filling in on play-by-play every now and again. If you're thinking my voice sounds familiar, it's because I've been on the radio for a good long while talking White Sox for the better part of a decade. This is all brand new. We are going to take this show, this camera, on the road with us as the White Sox travel down to the minors throughout the rest of the summer and bring you players and coaches and guys who are involved, directly involved in the development of the next Chicago White Sox. This was all Paul Janish's idea. He's the director of player development for the White Sox. He's our first guest on the show coming up in just a minute. And what the idea, the genesis of this was to bring out what it takes to develop players, not just from the organizational standpoint, but also from the player side. What did it take for this guy to get here and do this and learn how to do that? So we'll get to that in just a sec. At the end of the interview with Paul, you're going to hear from him about two players you may not have heard of yet that are making some noise down in the minors. And I think that's how we'll end every interview with Paul Janish, is try to, dig out a couple of players that deserve a little bit more respect. Congratulations to Kyle Teel and 𝗵𝗂𝗂𝗂, named minor league players of the month in May. Both are really good and both could be at the rate real soon. Their road to the rate a little bit shorter than others in the system. Thanks for listening. Really appreciate it. Coming up, White Sox Director of Player Development, Paul Janish, on Road to the Rate. So, Paul, thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Best way to start this whole thing is by getting you, because for a couple of reasons. One, you're the Director of Player Development for the White Sox. And two, this whole thing was kind of your idea. You and I were talking about a podcast like this centered around minor leaguers and player dev and all that stuff back in, I think it was Sox Fest. So thanks. And what appealed to you about this as a guy who's in charge of this kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's just one of those, and yeah, we have each other to thank for this. So we'll look forward to what this unfolds into. But yeah, I just think that we have a lot of exciting stuff going on the PD side, and with where the organization is, and with some of the hopefully exciting players that are currently in the minor leagues that will over the next year or two get to the major leagues and hopefully get their footing there and have success moving forward. I thought it was a kind of a good idea for us to highlight some of those things and some of the processes that we're trying to implement, and some of the guess and check that player development inherently is. So yeah, it's exciting to talk about, and I've got an affinity for podcasts to begin with. So I enjoy them, and I think in this current landscape, it's one of the ways to distribute some content.
We want to make this easy listening for White Sox fans. We want to make this understandable and intelligible. And there's so much player dev stuff that I think gets into the weeds. I was having a conversation with Corey Lee when the White Sox were in Baltimore, and he was describing what glove load is to me, right? Like a catcher getting set up and the whole deal. And I got completely lost. So I think one of the things that you and everybody else we're going to talk to on this podcast can help White Sox fans do is kind of get through the weeds of what you guys talk about when it comes to evaluating players. So from that angle, I wonder, what are kind of the cutting edge things that you guys are trying to push for players, onto players, and with players when it comes to getting them up through the levels and into the bigs?
Yeah, and I think Corey's a great example. He's obviously at the major league level, but he's just such a hard worker. When he was in Charlotte on his rehab assignment, I know he and Kyle Teel had a bunch of interaction that was just productive in terms of like your daily work. And when you ask about what we're trying to do, I think a lot of it goes back to a routine, right? Like helping guys develop a routine, and that means something different. Today is the opening day for our DSL league down in the Dominican, right? And so it means something different for those guys who we're trying to introduce to, even just playing games. Those the Dominican kids that signed that before they get to the complex, they haven't played a ton of games. So just becoming a professional with regards to a routine is something that we really harp on at the lower levels. And then you get towards the top, and we have access to so much data, and thanks to the front office and and the ownership group, we're having the opportunity to implement a lot of that, at some of the minor league affiliates that can really help us just be more objective. And that's where I would go. I would say one of the things we really focus on is just trying to be as objective as we can with regards to, acquiring the information relative to the player and his skill set, and then doing the best we can to be pretty direct with what that particular individual, whether we're talking about a pitcher or a position player, what they need to do in order to, give themselves the best opportunity. Number one, to have success where they currently are, because we really harp on that, be where your feet are. But like, we have to have the macro view of how we get this guy to the big leagues and have him be able to, add value to a major league team, hopefully one day.
So I think that's one of the more interesting things about player dev, like peeling that veil back a little bit. How much of your job and the coaches and everybody else that's assigned to getting these guys through every day, how much of player dev is taking things that a player is good at already and making him great at it versus addressing a player's weaknesses and raising the floor of a particular skill set? Because those are two very different coaching approaches.
Yeah, and I think it's a delicate line to walk. We really try to focus on, it's kind of the Happy Gilmore channel, good block bad kind of thing. And you got to be really careful on the player development side. I think with as soon as they show up, we want to point everything out that they can't do, right? Like, well, he's not good at this or he's not good at that, and none of us are perfect. There's very few players that can do everything on a baseball field, in particular at the major league level, because it is a hard game. So we try to focus on what they're good at, making them as good as they can be at whatever that carrying tool is. Be really good at that and know who you are, right? Like, that's what we preach that a lot, is know who you are. And look, with regards to the weaknesses, areas of development, we'll call them, we do bring those to light, and we focus on them from the standpoint of, kind of making them as good as they can be relative to, complementing what you're really good at, though. But we really try to stay away from being too focused on what they can't do, because that is, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy at times, and we really want to focus on what they're good at. And that goes from everything to the player acquisition process. I know, even all the way at the top with Chris, and some of the things they focused on with, moving forward with regards to offensive players and or pitchers that have a unique skill set to get a certain type of hitter out, or whatever the case might be. So we focus on those things too. And I think that through the acquisition process, it really helps us try to kind of narrow the funnel a little bit, so that once we have them in the house, we get a pretty good idea what we're trying to do.
What does it say to you about prospect? And I'm going to pick two guys that a lot of White Sox fans know about, because these stories are well known, but by no means am I saying these are the only two players to which this applies, right? But you get a guy like George Wolkow, or you get a guy like Braden Montgomery. George comes into this season and from what he said, told coaches, I need to get better at contact. This is the thing I want to get better at. Let's help do that. And for Braden, one of the things he wanted to do was address both sides of the plate, right? In college, an incredibly productive lefty hitter. Can he hit right-handed? And he's like, no, I'm a switch hitter. We got to get better at these things. So you've got players there who identify their areas of development and then go to coaches and say, hey, let's get this better. What does that say about that type of a player? How many more of those guys do you have, right? Because I think that's an interesting way to evaluate a system too, not just by the talents, but by the willingness and ability of players to work on themselves and on their own almost.
Yeah, and I think those two are good examples. Obviously, super talented guys. George, as the example first, he, the fact that he's saying that out loud, I think is really telling in the sense of guys that have an idea of what they need to work on versus kind of being in the dark and not we're just kind of hoping they get better at certain things. I think is what sticks out there to me, and that makes me think that as a staff we're doing a good job of sharing the truth with him, right? Like, and anybody else like that. We're trying to share the truth so that they know, tactfully and respectfully. We got to establish trust with these guys as well, along the road, so that they will be vulnerable and they will open up to us. But yeah, I think the fact that he's saying that is a really good sign, and it's true. He knows that when he connects with the ball. I think he's got a 116 or 17 mile an hour homer earlier this year. So it's in terms of impact, he's got that. But understanding what he needs to get better at, and almost like reverse engineering that. Like, what does that mean? George is an example, and a lot of guys. I had this issue at times too. But offensively, you want to go up there and swing as hard as you can, and that cue is not necessarily the right one for everybody. And with Braden, you're obviously going to hit left-handed more frequently than you are right-handed just because of the platoon splits. But one of the things we found with him is that he wasn't taking as many right-handed swings on most days because he's getting ready for a game to hit left-handed in most cases. And so, that was something that was super simple, but we've tried to, divide it up a little bit more evenly with him. And it's tough because both of those individuals probably lead our organization in swings taken, on a given day. They're just inherently hard workers. But again, what I would say, like, philosophically, that sticks out there is we just want to make sure guys know where they stand. And when we say where they stand, not just relative to the, low A or high A or double A league, relative to what it looks like to be successful at the major league level. And those are sliding scales, right? If a guy can hit the ball over the fence, with frequency, then, you can get away with, doing a little bit more swinging and missing because, you're going to deal with that as a result. But, just making sure that guys know who they are and what they do need to work on. And I think that helps us, gain ground with them and being able to accomplish, improvement in those certain areas. But in contact's one that's tough. It really is. It's, the ability to improve contact, especially as you move up with, where the stuff that you're facing is obviously going to get better. The pitchers are going to have better control. Like, that's one of the ones that sticks out to me on the development side. That is, it's a harder thing to improve for sure.
It's one of the things that Colson Montgomery was going to go work on when he went to Arizona with Brian Fuller, now back at 𝗵𝗄𝗄 Charlotte, of course, as we record this podcast, and hitting a lot better. I'd love to know about the organizational decision tree. Like, you guys have made choices like this, whether it's taking Colson aside and sending him to Arizona to rework, or Jairo Iriarte seems to be, I don't want to put them both on the same, kind of plan or whatever, but seems to be in a different situation as well, the normal development. The shift of Hagen Smith to a kind of a different than 5-day rotation kind of thing to work on some mechanics. You guys seem to be pretty aggressive when addressing issues that are kind of like underlying here. How did you arrive at those decisions? Obviously, it's not just you. It's a lot of people talking about this, but you also have to have, I think, all of those instances, players that are willing to take the road less traveled, right?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to establishing trust too with players throughout the system. And the ones you're highlighting, Colson and Iriarte, are obviously both on the 40-man and, one step away from the big leagues. Jairo obviously got exposed to the big leagues last year. And I think where that goes back to is just trying to do the best we can to put those guys in a position to succeed long-term at the major league level with those examples, because they are so close. And understanding, look, where they were, we as a group, to your point, didn't feel like that was going to equate to success at the major league level. And so as a result, we're like, hey, let's be a little bit more assertive here with, trying to solve some of these potential issues before we get there. And then understanding, like, it's not going to get easier at the major league level. If we're struggling, whether it's in Double A or Triple A, it really is hard to envision a situation that is, just going to fix itself at the highest level, most difficult level. So that's kind of where that comes from. We're just trying to be as assertive as we can. And honestly, like, it's, some of the questions I've been asked about some of those situations is, do you worry about, their confidence, and, like, is it a demotion type of deal? And sure, you do, but that's part of the evaluation of, yeah, but the selling point is, look, we're trying to get you ready to have success at the major league level. Like, we're not trying to mask these issues. We want to talk about them out loud. And to the point earlier, like, I think it benefits the player to understand, very clearly what they need to work on.
In a way, I was talking to Darren Jackson of the White Sox radio broadcast about this. In a way, you guys have broken the seal on this. And if you get, like, it's embarrassing, or it's hard, or it's a demotion if it doesn't happen a lot. But if it's part of your player development process, then it's something that we do as an organization. Is there thought toward that when we talk about, later on down the line, if we're doing this show again, 2 years from now, is this part of a regular process?
I believe so. Yeah. And I think it's, look, at the end of the day, you're trying to make the best decision for each individual player, but there are some ancillary benefits as well. We're talking about some pretty high profile guys. We've done this with some other guys in the system this year, and we'll continue to do so, just from the standpoint of, that kind of making the same mistake over and over again. And again, regardless of if we're talking about a position player or pitcher, and, just removing them from the competitive environment where, anybody who's been in a pro organization and and struggled severely can understand. Like psychologically, it's oftentimes more difficult than it is physically. But and just to get them out of it, all of these situations are done with a plan. Like we're not just taking a pitcher and sending them to Arizona with no thought of what we're going to try to fix. We have access to some resources down here in AZ that allow us to do a little bit more of deeper dives on specific guys. And so we do it with intention, and we share the narrative with the player. We're very trying to be very transparent, and then again, not using it as a I'm mad at you and you got to go back there because of this. It's hey man, we're going to be honest with you. We're going to tell you, look, this isn't quite good enough, and if you want to get to where you want to go, it's got to get better, and this is what this is for. And they're not intended to be 6, 7, 8 week type situations. This is a dosage type thing where we're like, hey, go take a deep breath, get back to what you're doing. If there's something significant mechanically, we address it. Generally speaking, that's not the case. It's more of a refining, fine tuning something and trying to revert back to when they were having some success and okay, have some success down here in the ACL, hopefully get them into games and experience the success and get them back out to the affiliate and get them going again. So it's, yeah, I like the concept that you described of breaking the seal, but it's something we're going to continue to utilize. And I think it inherently it conveys the message to other players too, that, we are emphasizing, making adjustments, producing, playing well, et cetera. And if that's not the case, we're gonna try to, expedite that process.
I wonder organizationally, kind of from a top-down perspective here, obviously the White Sox at the big league level need slugging percentage offensively, just to kind of pick one thing. It's something that they don't do right now. You've got prospects that have a potential for slug. We talked about George Wolkow, Braden Montgomery, Colson Montgomery, and others for sure. How, as a director of player development, do you go about finding and bringing slugging percentage, like a trait, let's be honest, a stat onto a big league roster? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a moving target. We talk about this a lot, and offensively specifically, I think that it's, you've heard people say there's a big gap between AAA and the big leagues, right? And I believe that that's true. But what we do, and what we talk about with our managers and our staffs is do the best we can. We want to think in terms of trying to have the player, whether we're talking about going from Kannapolis to Winston or Winston to Birmingham, or obviously Charlotte to the big leagues, do everything we can to get them as ready as they can be, whatever that means. And it means something different for a catcher. Like we talk about Edgar, who's up there now, and Teel, who's in Charlotte, and Tim Elko gets called up after having about the best 6 weeks he could have in Charlotte, and obviously he's back down again. But those types of guys, doing the best we can to look through the lens of like, look, if in a given game in Charlotte or Birmingham, if they were in Chicago tonight, was that good enough, kind of thing. And I think that's a profound way to try to approach it, and we all have an inherent higher sense of accountability if we do look at it that way. And with players that are one step away, I think you have to. And all that being said, we're going to convey the information to Chris and the front office with, how ready are they? Yeah, I think he's done everything that he can at the minor league level, and I really believe in the player's makeup, and I think he's going to give you what he's got. And we still don't know. Like once he gets there, the lights are a little brighter, the stuff's a little better and all that. So, but that's the way I would say we're doing the best we can to try to get the player as ready as he can be for the next level, and that's from top to bottom. And obviously, there's even more accountability at the top when you're going from Charlotte to the big leagues, and that's arguably the most difficult jump.
About 10 or 12 years ago, I was doing a talk show here in Chicago, and we were talking, I forget what prospect it was forever ago. And the guy I was doing the show with, they kind of said, well, that's what the minor leagues are. It's, 30 or so guys that exist to play games so that this one guy can make it to the bigs. And like 12 or 13 years ago, I probably nodded along and said, yeah, sure, whatever. And now, and even a few years ago, I think, well, listen, with Edgertronic, with the ability to change pitch grips, with all of the technology we've got and all the investment that teams are making in individual player development, you have now shifted to a completely different landscape where there are no org soldiers anymore, right? Like one little tweak gets this guy maybe 6 weeks in the bigs where he holds his own and that contributes to a division championship because he got you through an injury or what have you. I wonder just how far we are from even that, because that's how I thought about things a few years ago. And this changes in light speed. You know, I mean, the ability to dev guys like that changes so quickly. I feel like that take is probably a little behind.
I would agree. Yeah. And just from a system standpoint, we preach, if your goal is not to get the big league, you shouldn't be here. And I agree with that. Now, if we're being, math majors here, not everybody's going to play in the big leagues, but, I do think, to your point, like, it's guys don't understand how close they are. In particular, once, you get to Birmingham and you're having some relative success, like, they don't understand how close they might be. And, it's, again, that's not to make promises we can't keep. That's just to say, like, hey, we're going to bet on the guys that, continue to work. And in a lot of cases, a lot of successful major league players take away your, the superstar top 10% type guys. Their benefit was the fact that they weren't well thought of. They had to grind it through the minor leagues, and they had to figure out, how to solve some of their own problems. And, we, to your point now, with the availability of technology, data, et cetera, we can help expedite some of those problem solving. But, yeah, I think that it's, it's much more of it's more of a level playing field. There's more guys that have more information. They can improve their game in a way that makes them, have the ability to potentially add value to a major league team. But that being said, it's the stars still have to align in most cases for guys. They either have to, we use the terminology, you need to bang the door down. It's not what it used to be in terms of there's just not enough spots. So it's not what, you were in high last year, you get to go to AA this year no matter what, just because it's the next year. That's not the case. Like, and it goes the same for AA to AAA, and obviously from AAA to the big leagues. Like, you need to bang the door down. Don't expect to get something handed to you.
This will be the last one, and I think every time we have you on this podcast, I want to end with this, and it's going to put you on the spot a little bit, but that's the design of this whole thing.
Sure.
And we're going to talk to players and nothing, absolutely nothing. You're prepared for all of this. As we're talking, just to peel back behind the curtain, Kyle Teel and Jake Palich were named minor league players of the month for the White Sox. And we'll get into Teel and we'll get into Jake a little bit. But you talked about knocking down the door. Give White Sox fans a player in the system for the sake of today, not Teel and not Jake, because they just got named and we're going to talk about them, I think, throughout the entire week on the television side of things. Who is it that needs a little shine? Who is it that is closer or making some noise outside the door? Not a guy that's, ready to necessarily tear it down, but somebody that needs a little bit of, or could use, deserves a little bit of extra shine from the org, from your perspective. A guy that's, needing a little love from the boys at Future Sox or the 108 or Sox Machine. Who's that guy?
Yeah, you are putting me on the spot to name one guy. There's a couple of guys I'll highlight.
I'll take two. Two's fine. 2, 3 is fine. We got time.
Yeah. So, 𝗂𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗏's playing really well as an 18-year-old in his first full season. But the one that I would highlight would be Javier Mogollón, who's playing up the middle with him and Kannapolis. They're kind of alternating between short and second. Both of them are having very good years, and it's obviously Caleb's first year at a full season affiliate, and Javier's first year at a full season affiliate too. And those guys are down the chain a little ways off, obviously, in terms of talking about the major league team. But when you're talking about what's buried in the player development system that maybe is not getting talked about quite that much, obviously Bonnemer's got he's a good pick and had plenty of pub, but those guys are pretty exciting as potential middle of the field guys over the next few years that can really do a lot of things on a baseball field.
Paul, appreciate it. Thanks so much. Great job on the spot there. That was some good work. I really liked both of those players, actually, watching them. And I look forward to doing this again, my man. Thank you.
Yep, no, Connor, I appreciate it. And yeah, we'll make a habit out of this.
So that's episode 1 of Road to the Rate. Big thanks to Paul Janish, the White Sox Director of Player Development, for hopping on the show after all of his idea. In 2 weeks, we'll have our next episode. You're going to hear from minor league players themselves about what it is taking to get themselves closer to banging that door down like Paul was talking about. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you in a little while. This is Road to the Rate.